Please join me in welcoming Bart Lyman.
Thank you very much, Gail. I appreciate that. And again, just to echo a couple of things that Gail said, as we go through this presentation today, if you've ever seen me present before or attended one of my webinars, you know that I really welcome questions. If I go through information that you need me to clarify further, don't hesitate to stop me. I was joking with everyone before we started the webinar. It's a beautiful day here in Evanston. And I think part of my psyche growing up in Wyoming has been, as soon as there's a beautiful day in the spring, I want to do everything I can to get outside as quickly as I can. And so if that manifests itself today in me talking too fast, please feel free to slow me down. Again, I'm very passionate about this topic with MTSS and action planning in general. So I really want this to be a practical presentation for you. I'm going to get into some of the why behind using the MTSS Fidelity rubric and problem solving process. And then hopefully I'm going to wrap up with an example that can give you an idea of what this all looks like. So with that, we're going to get rolling. The objective today is really pretty straightforward. I want to use the MTSS Fidelity rubric. I want to show you how to do that, how to use that within the context of a problem-solving model that really you can use to generate an actionable plan for your school improvement. And again, I would like to know, we have about 26 participants here. Just a general question about your school improvement process, how you go through the steps of writing an action plan. And again, I just want a couple of people to share out what their experience has been, and a couple of thought questions for you. How do you determine the area of focus for your action plans? How do you organize efforts into meaningful goals? And then finally, how do you measure progress? What does your school or district do? I'll give you about 30 seconds, and then if a couple of people will chime in, I'd love to hear your responses.
So since we're using the webinar format, we can't unmute the microphones, but please feel free to respond to that in the chat, and Bart will be able to see it and comment on your comments. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Gail.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, feel free to type into the chat. You know, and I would actually add one question onto this. How effective do you feel like your action planning process is? And effective being defined by improved student performance or meeting student need, maybe a scale from 1 to 5. 5 being very effective, 1 minimally effective. Any thoughts? I'm sorry, I wish I could see you. I don't know if people are typing or not. Oh wait, oh there we go. Thank you, Stacy. All right, here we go. Some are coming in now. Thank you, Stacy. In my experience, we determine areas of focus by using data. Excellent. We try to formulate goals based on needs from what data shows. Awesome. Thank you, Stacy. Kevin, our leadership team determines areas of focus and measurements of progress. Awesome. Alan, typically our school improvement plans are developed by a select few and/or administration based on state assessment data. Wonderful. Yeah, and I think that process is pretty similar for probably every school in every district across the state. A select team looks at data and really determines area of need. And today, I'm going to give you a little bit of a twist on that. Certainly, we're going to look at data. But one thing that I've seen with action plans is oftentimes we look at data and then it just becomes a brainstorming about what could be wrong or where we should put our efforts. And then it becomes opinion based. And so what I want to do today is present this idea of bringing in the MTSS Fidelity rubric, because once we look at the data, we really need to have something that we can focus on that will lead us towards best practice, right? That will say, here's the areas where you need to improve, and then you can build an actionable plan around that. So it's good to look at the data. It's good to identify areas of need. We just want to put our efforts into places that will pay off for us academically, behaviorally, all of those things. So one thing that I wanted to bring up is, can you relate to these different statements with action planning? Where do we begin? Lots of things are happening, but we are not getting the student achievement results we expect. It feels like we are all over the place and don't know if we are choosing the right areas to correct. We start with good intentions, but are never able to follow through. And then finally, it seems like we are always starting something new. And when I've heard these statements in different presentations, I guess what that suggests to me is we have processes, but again, even within our processes, there may be misalignment. So maybe we don't know what we're choosing. Maybe we're not as informed as we would hope to be when we're setting goals for these action plans. Maybe there's lack of a planning process. I mean, there are all different ways that this process can go awry. So some of these statements really lead me to that conclusion, and that's why I really put this presentation together. I felt like teams needed to have a process, needed to have tools, again, that they could use and feel confident in their school improvement plans or MTSS action plans. And we know that if that's the case, if we've been stuck in a cycle of planning but never really realizing the results, it can often feel like we're chasing our tails a little bit. So I'm hopeful that this process and this information will help you feel a little more targeted in your plans, and know what to do moving forward with your MTSS work. And again, it's all about results, right? When we're building an improvement plan, we need a framework that keeps us focused on meaningful practices and helps us progress monitor our efforts. We want to see at the end of our action plans that what we've done intentionally has had the impact that we planned on. So again, I'm hopeful that this process will help you with that. And I understand that this is a little bit of an alternative to what has been done, it sounds like, in your districts and schools. But I really think this is a marriage made in heaven, for lack of a better term. Using a problem-solving process, again, that walks us through the steps of identifying, is there a problem? Why is it happening? What are we going to do about it? Was that effective? Marrying that process with the MTSS Fidelity rubric, which again is based on best practice. And when we do those two things together, we really do have an actionable school improvement plan. So I just wanted to highlight the two components of this really quickly. Like I mentioned, the problem-solving process. Now, there are lots of different names for continuous improvement processes, problem-solving processes. they all basically boil down to these basic components, right? What I just mentioned earlier, there are 4 questions. What is the problem? Why is it happening? What should be done? And did it work? That can be more complex depending on the model you use, and maybe you have something slightly different from this. I use these 4 questions just out of simplicity. They're easy to walk teams through, and it doesn't become overly burdensome to answer them. There are problem-solving models that have 6 questions, 8 questions, a little bit different take on the process, but this is what I use. And then obviously the MTSS Fidelity rubric, and I've said it a couple of times, the MTSS Fidelity rubric really focuses us on best practice. And whether you call it MTSS or not in your districts, I would argue that if you have a core curriculum, if you are intervening for students, if you are individualizing instruction based on data, you are inherently doing MTSS. So this is related to what you're doing, even if you're not formally saying you're doing MTSS. And again, the rubric is really based on what research says are necessary components to implement MTSS with Fidelity. And I just wanted to pull out a couple here, and you have these links in my presentation. So let me just show you a couple of examples. So screening tools. We know screening within MTSS is about identifying students who may be at risk for poor learning outcomes. So understandably so would be on the rubric, but just listen to this definition. And I want you to think about if you were evaluating your MTSS or your screening processes, if this would be helpful to you. So with screening tools, evidence indicates that the screening tools are reliable. So it doesn't matter who does them, we get the same results. Correlations between the instruments and valued outcomes are strong. So we're screening for skills that we know are predictive of academic or behavioral success. And the predictions of risk status are accurate. So we're identifying the right students who need intervention. And staff is able to articulate the supporting evidence. So people understand what tools we've chosen, why we're using them, and can use the results and communicate the results effectively. So you can see how even just with this one example of screening tools, if you're to use the Fidelity rubric, it really takes you into that realm of best practice, research-based practice, evidence-based practice. Let me give you, let's go through another one here just really quickly so you can get a flavor. I like tier 1. All right, so tier 1, research-based curriculum and materials. So with all of our tier 1, all core curriculum materials are research-based for the target population of learners. So again, you can see how if you're problem solving using this rubric, it's always going to pull you back into that realm of best practice. Okay, so that gives you a sense. But again, you have a whole rubric that's going to go through all of the components of MTSS, which are screening, multi-level prevention systems. It'll go through the tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, progress monitoring, database decision-making, and then infrastructure for MTSS implementation. So this is a really powerful tool. And what I've said to schools is, as long as you have a problem-solving process, and I may be oversimplifying, but I think as long as you have a problem-solving process and you are coming back to this rubric yearly, you can implement MTSS. It's really that powerful. And as you can see as well, the descriptions aren't necessarily prescriptive, but they're going to give you a context where you can make some decisions around how you approach that different component or that different criteria so that you're choosing things that fit within the context of your school or your district. So very powerful, very powerful. Okay. Like I said, again, just a beautiful match. Problem solving process, MTSS Fidelity rubric, right? Using those two things, we can really start identifying why we're not meeting student need. And once we go through those ratings, get a sense for what we're doing well, as well as areas that we may need to address that may be impacting student need negatively. So yeah, very important, very important. Okay, so the when, who, and what. Just some of the brief logistics around using the problem solving process with the MTSS Fidelity rubric. This is really something that you would do once a year. The people who do this, generally leadership teams. And I say leadership teams because they're going to have the stakeholder representation that you need to really go through this process meaningfully, and then have the decision makers to implement with fidelity. So leadership teams at the school or district level. Also, if you have an MTSS team, certainly they can do it. I don't see an MTSS team really looking that different from a leadership team. So I kind of use those two synonymously. The what is really prioritizing need. And we think about the MTSS Fidelity rubric, and we'll discuss this even more in a minute. We want to choose the simplest things that we can do that will give us the greatest impact. So those are some of the logistics. All right, so what we're going to do now is go through the 4 problem-solving questions. And I'm going to provide some general direction on embedding the MTSS Fidelity rubric, and we'll see it through to an action plan. Again, if you have any questions about why I'm presenting it this way or the material, please stop me and ask. I think this, as I get into this process with you, you're going to see it's not, I say this a lot too in my presentations, it's not rocket science. And I really don't think that it has to be more complex than what I'm suggesting. But again, feel free to stop me, push back. If you have questions, ask. So we start with what is the problem? And what is the problem is really defining the difference between where we want to be and where we currently are. And it's within that gap that we say, okay, there's a need here that we should address, right? So we have to establish that first. The guiding questions are pretty straightforward as well, right? Where are we? Where do we want to be? And do we even need to make a change? Okay, so those questions help you define that. Again, pretty straightforward. The data source that I use for this step is summative data. So I use YTOP data. And the reason is pretty straightforward. The state uses summative data to grade how we're doing as schools and districts. So we have a vested interest in using summative data and making it meaningful and trying to align with what the YTOP is measuring. And I say that knowing that it's not a perfect test. I know that it's not as diagnostic sometimes, at least the way I'm going to use it, as people would like. But really with summative data, you can look quickly and say, how is our system doing, right? We can get into the weeds later, but summative data for me is really a screener for systems in a sense. So let me walk you through that process really quickly. So I have a data dive sheet that I use. This is the one that I use in my presentations. It could be adapted if you have something different that you want. I think one of those obvious adaptations is to add every grade. When I use this, I'm just trying to get people to quickly look at data and say, how are we doing proficiency-wise within a grade and then across time? So if you were doing this with an elementary school, let's say, you could add 3rd, 4th, and 5th to this sheet and use it that way. I look at reading and English language arts, and then also math. And then I break it up by elementary and secondary. So again, you can modify this form if you would like to. I really look at 4 subgroups. So I look at all students. Again, all students gives me a quick reading on how Tier 1 instruction is. I look at IEP, the IEP student subgroup, free and reduced lunch student subgroup, and the ELL subgroup. I choose those because it gives me a sense of Tier 2 and Tier 3, right? So again, all students, how's our Tier 1 doing? Are we scoring in the proficient and advanced range to the percentage that we want? And then these other subgroups, are they also getting quality interventions and data-based individualization at Tier 3? This gives me what I need when I look at this. So let me walk you through it really quick. So that's the data dive sheet that I use. And then I just go, I know you guys have different tools in the districts, and that's okay. Maybe more fancy tools. I just go here every time. Just the WDE website that has the YTOP results. I go to disaggregated data because I want to look at those subgroups. You can go to the school or the district level, whichever team is doing this problem solving. You just choose your district. I'm just gonna choose a district that I worked in. So you went to 1 school. Let's do you went to Meadows. Okay, and then I go with English language arts or math. And then I just select the grades. Okay. Click view report. And now pretty easy. The data can be overwhelming at first, but I really start by looking at the subgroup, right? Because that's where we're going to identify those 4 subgroups. So I look at all students, which is right here, subgroup, first line. And then I go all the way over here to the proficient and advanced column. So we can see here the number of students in 3rd grade at Uinta Meadows Elementary on the English language arts test. 51% of those are scoring in the proficient and advanced range. And then I'll just go down to the next subgroup, right? So I'm just scrolling through. I see English language learner. Okay, so there's not enough students in their ELL group to form a subgroup. So I just write NA in my chart. I can see free and reduced lunch here for 3rd grade. Okay, go all the way over 46.15% proficient and advanced. Okay, same thing for IEP. So students within IEP, 37.5% scoring in the proficient and advanced range. So I just take this data and I put it in my chart. Okay, and then let's see here. Okay. I put it in my chart, and I'm going to pull up an example here in just a second. But once I have that chart filled out, then we have the conversation. What is our goal for proficiency rate? Okay, that's the target again that we're shooting for. And this is sometimes a tricky conversation because once we throw out a number, then to some degree we're accountable to that, and we have to start talking about why or why not we're meeting that threshold. But critical again for us to establish that gap. Where do we need to address? Where do we want to be? Where are we currently? So you have to decide on your proficiency rate. So here's an example. This is fictitious data, but just to illustrate the point. So we have school A. They're looking at 3rd grade through 5th grade ELA data. Their goal is for students to be at least 80% of their students to be scoring in the proficient or advanced ranges in each of these grades. Okay, so if 80% is their threshold, and you look at this data, is there a problem? Go ahead and type it into the chat box, yes or no. Is there a problem that school A needs to address? Not where is it yet, but just is there something more happening that we need to look at? Okay, good. Yep, absolutely. The answer is yes, right? Because in each of these categories, I mean, in third grade for all students, 63%, still not close to the threshold of 80. So what we've done is establish that difference, but we've also created a foundation for our plan. When we're communicating, and you each mentioned this, using data to develop a plan, what we've done with this step is really create a justification. We've looked at our ELA data for third through fifth grade. We're generally between 16 points and 25 points behind where we want to be with all students. So we see that there's a need to do something more. And when you start out a conversation like that, people can buy in really quickly because they see the why behind what you're doing, okay? So that is the first step for your action planning. What is the problem? Okay, we've established that. There's a difference. Why is it happening? Now, this is a step where action planning can get a little squirrely sometimes. When we answer the question, why is it happening? Typically everyone has an idea, an opinion about that, and we've got very well-trained professionals who have lots of experience. This is an area where I think we really need to refocus on best practice. What is best practice for meeting student need? And so that's why, again, why I pull the MTSS Fidelity rubric in with this step, okay? So let's walk through it a little bit. When you're doing this step, why is it happening? Again, just some basic logistics before we get to the process. School or district leadership team, again, there are some people I recommend having on this team, an administrator, so that they can be responsible for resource allocation, follow-up if that needs to happen. School psychologists generally can be helpful with looking at data, maybe best practices with curriculum or interventions. They bring that piece to the table. Grade level lead teachers also have lots of experience, lots of training in what they're doing. So they also have a sense about what's happening in the classrooms and what maybe could be tweaked. And then finally, a curriculum facilitator or coach. I think it's important to set norms for this process. The norms are pretty straightforward, but critical. So 3 norms that I like: we have a commitment to student results. We're focused on evidence, not opinion. And we have to have courage to have an honest conversation. I say the norms are critical for this process because when you use a tool like the MTSS Fidelity rubric and you say, okay, we're going to focus on evidence-based practice, research-based practice for what works, you can already tell there's going to be a little bit of tension there. And the tension comes in the form of team members maybe who have invested a lot of time or experience championing a program or intervention. Sometimes these conversations kind of take on a personal bent, and they shouldn't, right? This is just about looking at our system and what we need to do differently. And so this prep work with your team as you get into this step is very important. You want to make sure that you take the time to prepare people, to make sure, again, that this is not personal. We're all in this together. We just want to get better. And that will help as you get into these discussions about the Fidelity rubric. So pretty straightforward stuff. As a team, you rate your system using the rubric. This is the process that I use. I think it's helpful. Everyone at the table has a rubric. You read one item at a time. After you read the item, each member of the team will rate that particular item. You also let them know that their ratings, they should be able to provide some kind of justification or evidence for why they're suggesting a particular rating. So everyone comes up with their rating for the criteria. Everyone shares their rating. If there are discrepancies, you talk through those. Bart, I see that you rated us a 3. Dan, you rated us a 5. Dan, what evidence do you have for rating us a 5? Bart, is there something you saw in the 5 rating that you didn't think we met? Why? So just coming to consensus about that. And those discussions can be pretty enlightening for people, because oftentimes people will go through, they're just functioning as part of a system. So to really step back and analyze what's happening, oftentimes things will come to the surface that you didn't even realize were challenges. So very powerful. You go through all items on the rubric. Again, part of the preparation for your team can be to say, hey, we're going to look at strengths and we're going to look at challenge areas. And the rubric always brings that out. It doesn't matter what the system is or where you are. They're going to be areas that you're doing well, and they're going to be challenge areas. And that's just part of the deal. Okay. All right. So things to watch out for when you're going through the Fidelity rubric. Don't take it personally. Again, we just want to get better. If you don't know, rate yourselves lower. The reason for that is somewhat obvious. We don't want to overestimate what we're doing and miss possibly an area that should be addressed, okay? If you rate yourselves lower and someone comes back and, Dan and I have different ratings, I come back and I say, okay, here's my evidence for why I rated us a 3. Or he comes back and says, here's evidence for the 5. We can always adjust that if we need to, okay? Don't get overwhelmed. Again, this is a process. And I really am intrigued with the idea of incremental change over time, right? So if you can engage in this action planning repeatedly for multiple years, you're going to see pretty big changes to your MTSS framework, which is perfect, right? We're just saying, hey, we're going through the Fidelity rubric. We want to be aware of what's happening. And then we'll take the next bite out of that elephant, right? Generally 3 to 7 years to fully implement MTSS. And that's why we've got to take these measured and intentional steps. We have to stay committed to the outcome, and you just want to keep going through this until you get there. And I guarantee that when you have a fully functioning MTSS framework, you're going to be meeting the needs of students. So all of this is attainable. And I put this to address one area at a time. Often it's easy to get into, and I've seen teams do this, say, we want to do a Fidelity rubric for reading, math, behavior, okay? And it almost becomes paralysis by analysis. You have so much information that you don't know where to start. I think when you're going through this process for the first time, I think you choose one area, and one of those, behavior, reading, math. You choose one of those and you stick with it. You let the other ones go for a minute. Once you get more savvy about this process and the habit and the routine becomes ingrained with your team, you can take on those other pieces. But initially, when there's this learning curve, just choose one area. Take the time that you need. This is a lengthy process. So anywhere from half a day to a day. I think it can be done effectively in half a day, but again, you want to have those rich discussions that will really help your team build awareness for the system, what they're doing, again, what's happening, that's going well, and then areas of need. Another question I often get with this is, where should we start? Okay, and this is gospel according to Bart. So feel free to argue with me. I wish you would. I feel like I'm talking to myself. So if you disagree with anything I'm about to say, I want you to push back. Because teams will fill out the Fidelity rubric, right? They'll go through all of the components and then they'll say, where should we start? We see improvement areas in each of the components, okay? This is the order that I suggest, okay? I think the first thing to address is make sure that your infrastructure to support MTSS is in place. It doesn't make sense to start out an initiative and you don't have those supports, those understandings, those resources within your system to adequately implement. So you want to make sure the infrastructure piece is addressed. Next, I think you go into screening, okay? Screening data really drives a lot of what we do in our multi-level prevention system, okay? So if you have good screening data, then you're more apt to set up your tiers appropriately, okay? And I think along with that, and I put it under the screening, gathering screening data, having those data routines and processes. So you're gathering the screening data, and then you're saying, here's how we're going to use this, right? You're showing that it's relevant, you're tying it to your next steps, but you're showing that it's important and you're using it, okay? So infrastructure, screening, tier one, right? Is our next step, is our tier one robust? Okay, are we meeting approximately 80% of student need? Okay, and I know 80% is somewhat variable, right? We want to, that number can change depending on the resources we have for our multi-level prevention system, but 80% is generally the rule for making sure that we have the other two tiers and they're functioning effectively and efficiently. We meet 80% of the needs with what we do for all students, and then we can really target and hone in with tier 2 and tier 3. Next, do we have effective tier 2 supports? Approximately 15%. And then effective progress monitoring tools and processes, okay? Now that we have students in tier 2, we need to track their progress, right? So let's really dial in our progress monitoring. And then finally, tier 3, DBI, approximately 5%. So that is the order that I suggest. And I'll give you an example of why I suggest this. So oftentimes with teams, they'll say, we want interventions. We want MTSS to just we want to choose tier 2 interventions. Everything else is good. And I say, well, okay, you know, we can get some solid tier 2 interventions, but if you don't have screening data, how are you going to make sure you have the right kids in those tier 2 interventions? Or if you don't have screening data, how do you make sure that you're being as effective as you can in tier 1 to make sure that your tier 2 interventions aren't getting overloaded? So let's see, what else? Even with DBI, so we'll say a team says, well, we want to start at tier 3 because our SPED kids, I mean, they're just not making the growth that they need to. And DBI is a great process, right? it's also dependent on having evidence-based tier 2 interventions. It's also dependent on having progress monitoring routines and tools in place. So you can start with tier 3, but you're eventually going to come back to these other things. So I could do that with each of these. Again, that's why I suggest this sequence. Any questions about that? Okay. All right. All right, so what should be done? So we've gone through establishing what the problem is. We don't have the proficiency rates that we want. We've identified why the problem is happening based on evidence-based, research-based practices in the MTSS Fidelity rubric. We've seen our weaknesses, we've seen our strengths. Now we have to make a choice. What are we going to do? And I just showed you the sequence that I would suggest. So we make a choice about what we're going to build our action plan around. I think a critical question for this step is, what is the simplest thing that we can do in the area of need to move our MTSS work forward? I say simplest because, as you all know, implementation within systems is challenging at best. When we're starting this process, it helps to have some initial small wins to build momentum with people and buy-in. So, for example, a simple thing when you're looking at tier 1, you may not want to jump directly to, we're going to overhaul our reading curriculum, okay? So there are probably some other little things that you could do in tier 1, like high leverage practices, things like that people could learn quickly and may have an impact without jumping to eating the whole elephant. So again, just be cognizant of that. What your team, what your system can manage, implement with Fidelity. Again, in the beginning, often those are the simple things, okay? I do have a goal setting sheet. Again, there's probably about 1 billion of these out there. This is what I use and like, but I think all of the goal setting sheets out there have similar components, okay? But I did include this as a resource for you. All right, so the components of a good plan, nothing here is going to be new to you, right? We just want to make sure that we account for everything. And there are lots of ways to build the plan. So first, area of need, we've clearly stated that, and it's tied to the component on the MTSS Fidelity rubric. Again, we want to, you can see we're trying to create those clear linkages, right? We've gone through the process, problem identification, and now in our action plan, we're saying, okay, here's the area we're going to address, and it's tied back to that previous step, okay? We have a goal, which includes evidence of completion and due date. We identify strengths that might be helpful when implementing identified areas of need. We identify possible barriers. We brainstorm ideas for addressing barriers that can be addressed in the plan. We outline task assignments to be accomplished by whom with due dates. And then we have review due dates for the plan. Okay, again, all really straightforward stuff. So here's an example of how I would type this out. And we'll go back to school A. We'll say that school A, remember at the best, they were 16 percentage points away from where they wanted to be in 3rd grade with ELA students. As they talked and went through the MTSS Fidelity rubric, they said, wow, we're not really sure about our screening tools. That was rated a 1, and screening is super important for us to identify reading risk. So we want to start there. We want to have a solid tool that we can use the data for making further decisions. So they tied it back to the MTSS Fidelity rubric, right? Screening, rating 1. And the reason that they chose it, again, insufficient evidence that the screening tools are reliable, correlations between the instruments and valued outcomes are strong, and predictions of risk status are accurate. Okay, so they have some real questions about their screening tool. The goal, based on that, again, you'll see the linkages. By May 31st, 2022 school year, School A will have researched, selected, and implemented a valid and reliable screening instrument. Evidence of completion will be benchmark screening data being completed by spring of 2022. So you can see that's a goal that's measurable and we can build a plan around, right? School A also said, all right, screening tools, we have some strengths here. So the strengths that they identified, they have a school psych who worked in a district that completed screening 3 times a year. Okay, so that school psych can be helpful in messaging this, interpreting data, looking at tools. They have some experience, so we'll utilize that. They have a group of teachers who have base knowledge of screening and have attended training. Again, maybe some superficial knowledge, but could really be helpful in building processes, building buy-in, and choosing a tool. They have an administrator who has some ideas about what screening instruments, I'm starting to want to get outside. They have an administrator who has some ideas about what screening instruments are available. So already, I mean, you can tell that they have some knowledge about where to go. As they're moving forward, these strengths can be helpful. As they're building their action plan, they can come back and say, hey, let's tap into that group of teachers who, I mean, they have some knowledge of screening, they've been to training. Let's have them help us plan how we're going to use this data, right? We have a school psych who's done screening. Let's have them take a lead role in the team when we're choosing a screening instrument. So you're utilizing those strengths while you're going through and accomplishing your goal. One of the barriers for Team A, teachers may be resistant to making change, okay? Lots of bias about testing. So again, we want to acknowledge it and explicitly state it so that we can plan around it, right? So with Team A, they may want to be overly, they want to be intentional about how they're communicating what's happening with choosing a screening tool and how they're going to use that data. They're doing a lot of preparatory work to keep other staff involved, to keep them up to date. They're being very transparent, so this barrier doesn't come back and haunt them later, okay? So ideas for addressing the barriers, right? Again, frequent communication, training, showing relevance. So again, this is setting us up for what we're gonna do and who's gonna do it, all the completion dates, all of that. And you can look through this later. I'll just go through a few of these. I think the best way to do this is to just, when you're first developing your plan, just brainstorm. Just say, okay, we need to select a screening instrument. What are all of the things that we can think of that need to happen before we do that? Okay, and just start listing them along the assignment, in the assignment column. Okay, just come up with as many as you can. Don't worry about putting them in chronological order yet. Just get everyone's ideas. What do we need to do? What are the areas that we identified as barriers? What are the activities we need to plan on for that? Let's make sure that's in here. And so you're just brainstorming, right? The next step is to say, okay, who is the best person to do that particular activity? Or who is the natural fit, right? They said that they needed to choose a team and a team leader to choose a screening instrument. Well, that's an administrator function. So you just go through and explicitly assign those activities. The next step is to put them in chronological order, right? So then you just say, okay, what needs to happen first, right? And that takes a little bit of work, but it goes pretty quickly. Once you get through about half of the list, you'll see that the rest works itself out. So that's how I do this. I try to be overly explicit, and I try not to leave any activities out. If you plan for it, I mean, it'll happen. You have a due date, you have the person responsible. This document really then becomes the roadmap for accomplishing your goal. You will come back multiple times to this throughout the year. If you have an MTSS team, if I had a team who was choosing a screening instrument, I'd probably have them meet every other week initially. And then after we did our first benchmark, maybe once a month. But I would always come back to this and say, okay, have we accomplished? Have we completed these activities? Team lead, I want you to give me a report on this. Administrator, can you talk about this? Bart, can you talk about what you've been doing? This keeps people accountable and makes it very explicit about what people need to do, okay? I fleshed this out all the way up through the first benchmark. So you can kind of see how I would view choosing a screening instrument. If you run into challenges with this, if you choose an area and you want some feedback or want me to sit in and maybe give you some ideas for activities, please let me know. I'm happy to do that. I think when you have a team of 3 to 8 people who are leaders in your building, these things just kind of naturally come to the surface. But I'm certainly willing to help if you need it, okay? All right, so that takes us through what's the problem, right? Our difference between proficiency rates, areas of need. We identified what the problem was, the team did by using the MTSS Fidelity rubric. What are we going to do about it? I showed you how to build an action plan. You have the key components. You also have a resource that you can fill out. Next and final question, did it work? And so this is just plan review, right? And if we get in the process of doing this once a year, it's just going to be part of our organizational habit, right? So did it work? You all know these, right? It's just a basic debrief. What lessons did we learn? What progress did we make towards our goal? What are next steps, right? That's the heart of the discussion. We can also be very explicit, right? When we start looking at our goals. So those are all good debrief questions and will give us lots of information that we can use to build into the next plan. These are specific questions around goal accomplishment. So did we accomplish our goal? If yes, right, we go through that process again. We go through looking at data. We go through using the MTSS Fidelity rubric, building an action plan around the next logical step in our MTSS implementation, right? Build a new plan for the next year. No, we didn't accomplish our goals. So the question is, was the plan implemented with fidelity? Okay. If it was, then we problem solve the plan. Did we have the correct area of focus? Did we adequately plan? Did we maybe miss steps in our plan that we need to go back and correct? So again, you're learning and you're building those learnings into your next plan. If the plan wasn't implemented with fidelity, you problem solve why and take care of that, right? And you may create a new plan or you may stick with the one you had before. Honestly, if you're following up with your team and you're meeting regularly and you've developed those activities, they're in chronological order, you're constantly saying, hey, let's report out on what activities are completed. I mean, things should happen for you and you shouldn't run into a fidelity question. But really, that's all there is to it for the did it work question. Again, this is a continuous improvement cycle. So we do it again. We do it every year. We do it every year. Things to remember, just in finishing up, process is meant to be cyclical. It's about continuous improvement. And we need to have the right people at the table. Make sure you have the stakeholders that can help you align resources that can help you communicate to other staff, other stakeholder groups. You have people who can look at data, who understand best practice. You have people who are willing to engage in honest conversation about how the system is doing. Those are the necessary components. And then you just stay committed to the process. Again, this takes some time to implement an MTSS framework. But if you do this, and I stand by this statement, if you have good problem solving, if you have a good problem solving process, and you're willing to engage the MTSS Fidelity rubric, you can implement MTSS. You will get there. There are enough resources out there to help you do that. But this process is critical and has to be done, again, yearly. All right, that was a lot of me talking. Are there any questions?
I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, but I have a question for you, Bart.
Please, please.
You consult with a lot of different schools in Wyoming, and you work with a lot of teams. What would you say is, how do I want to put this, the biggest mistake that teams make, or the thing that is most often overlooked or undervalued in the process?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, there are two things. We're data rich, information poor at times. And I think teams can get so focused on data that they have a hard time knowing where to move or what area to move into to improve. So that really becomes paralysis by analysis. I think the other area is, why is it happening? And the why is it happening often comes down to people's biases and opinions. And we're all well-meaning, myself included. I mean, I can go off the rails if I don't have like the Fidelity rubric or standards that I'm adhering to, right? If it just gets into Bart's theories, you know, that may or may not be accurate sometimes. So I think when they get into that step and it becomes, you know, we're just going to start throwing opinions at the wall and see what sticks, who's talking the loudest, who's talking the most, does that sound like a good idea? That's the other area where I see people kind of, and it's not focused on best practice, if that makes sense. So. And again, I don't mean that to sound bad. Lots of well-meaning, good intended people, you know, it just get wonky.
Totally. So we do have a question.
Okay.
I think it's supposed to be, what does MTSS stand for? But it says, what does MSTT stand for?
Multi-tiered system of supports.
Good basic question.
Yeah.
And in the chat, Kelly says, love that question. Totally agree that we are data rich and information poor. We look at data all the time and then have a harder time answering the question, where do we go from here?
Yeah. And I really try to keep it simple. Like, I mean, there would be a lot of people have disagreed with me about just using that summative data piece. But I don't want the time and the energy of the team to be spent on just chewing through data, because it feels heavy, it's labor intensive. At the end of it, I mean, you run into those questions about where we should go. So for me, that summative data piece from, you know, the process that I showed you is really helpful, because I can look and I can direct teams to look at information really quickly. I mean, that's a 20-minute exercise. They can get a snapshot of their system and say, okay, we need to look further. And that's all you really need, right? And then the rubric does the rest.
Great point. Thank you, Kelly. Do we have any questions? Now's the time. We've got this expert here to answer your questions. And I appreciate that you also offered if teams are struggling, they can give you a call and
Oh, totally.
you
Yeah.
will help them. Yeah.
And I would love to do that. I think sometimes these discussions, it helps to have kind of a third party come in if there's a lot of personal bias or ideas about where things should go. And yeah, I mean, I'm happy to help with any of that stuff. And any of these steps, I mean, feel free to email me, call me. I mean, I want you to be successful. So I'm willing to help however I can.
Thank you, Bart.
Yep.